Okay, this is part two of the Dana Scott Turing Award interview. Dana is in Berkeley and myself, Gordon Plotkin, I'm in Edinburgh. It's December the 29th, 2020. And we begin the interview at Princeton. So Dana, how did you get to know Kreisel and Gödel?
When I got to Princeton, of course, it was a very big environment, lots of mathematicians, because the Institute for Advanced Study uh, brings so many people there uh, into Princeton. Uh, and Steenrod, of course, was in his most active period and had many graduate students. There were other very interesting professors there too. Ralph Fox in knot theory, I took lectures from him. That was very interesting. I wish I'd taken the lectures from Emil Artin on algebra, and I wish I'd learned more about algebraic topology as I should have done, but I was too concentrated on logic, I'm afraid. Toward the end of my first year, my living accommodation was not so good. And Kreisel had begun his more than 2-year visit at the Institute for Advanced Study. And I got to know him. I mean, there were lots of meetings with logicians. Uh, I met Gödel. Church had various parties. I think Bernays visited, and Church had a party for graduate students to meet these people. But I didn't really get to know Gödel very much in the beginning, but I did become good friends with Kreisel. And so it turned out that he wanted to rent a small house out in the country. And so we agreed to share that house uh, out there. And there were very many visitors who came there. I remember distinctly that Gödel was invited to tea out there, and I was assigned to drive Gödel out to the tea party at Kreisel's. And during the drive, I turned to emphasize something and turned to Gödel to say something. And he said, "Keep your eyes on the road." He was a very nervous uh, person in the car. One of my favorite stories about him uh, was that one year the Reidemeisters were visiting from Vienna, old friends that Gödel knew when he was a student in Vienna, and they were staying with the Gödels. And it was decided that a drive in the beautiful countryside would be very nice on the Sunday, but Professor Gödel decided he wouldn't take part in that. So Mrs. Gödel was driving the Reidemeisters, and all of a sudden she said, "Oh, it's so wonderful to be out driving without a genius in the back seat." My other favorite story about Gödel was from Church's secretary. Church had enormous work with the Journal of Symbolic Logic and doing the reviews section, and he had a full-time secretary to help him on that. She was a wife of a graduate student in topology, and I knew both of them very, very well. And she reported that she was on the city bus one day, and that was a period when Gödel had been in the hospital. And Mrs. Gödel got on the bus at a bus stop, and a friend of hers greeted her and said, "Oh, oh, how is your husband doing?" And Mrs. Gödel threw up her hands and said, "Oh, that man, he's nothing but a brain on two legs." I think what she meant was that nobody ever won an argument with Gödel because he could think of too many if, ands, and buts and alternatives. He must have driven his doctors absolutely insane because he would object to anything that was proposed on some grounds or the other. And so it was always very difficult with his medical things. Later, when I was in Princeton, I got to know Gödel much more. especially through his friend Oscar Morgenstern of von Neumann Morgenstern fame. Morgenstern was also from Vienna, and Gödel was always an extremely charming person. I wouldn't say any problems about being a brain on two legs, but Mrs. Gödel had a different relationship with him. In any case, Kreisel introduced me to quite a lot of things, especially concerning intuitionistic mathematics. As an undergraduate, I'd studied Tarski's papers on modeling intuitionistic mathematics, the so-called topological interpretation, but I didn't have an understanding for intuitionistic mathematics, which I gained much more through the association with Kreisel. Kreisel and Gödel during that period were also working very, very closely together. They might spend hours on the telephone talking to each other every day, because talking on the telephone meant you weren't spreading any germs. And so they both, being hypochondriac, like that. But in any case, the relationship to Kreisel, both as a friend, but also as a teacher for things that I hadn't learned before, was what happened there during my middle years there at Princeton.
To perhaps a central question of the interview. Michael Rabin was a fellow graduate student of yours at Princeton. And obviously, as we all know, it was your work with Rabin that led to your joint 1976 Turing Award with your famous invention of non-deterministic finite automata. Could you tell me all about that, please, about Rabin and how you worked with him, where it was, how it came about?
Yes, well, there were quite a few graduate students there. Simon Koshin was a very important one. Raymond Smulyan came also as a graduate student. Was a very lively atmosphere. Michael Rabin was a year ahead of me, and we became very good friends. I don't remember if he got married while he was at Princeton or very shortly after that. But it turned out in 1957, that was my second year at Princeton, IBM recruited summer internships. And so both Rabin and I were chosen to go to IBM Yorktown Heights Research Center. The very fancy building that they have today wasn't quite completed then, and IBM had rented an estate, a vacant estate. The family had passed away. And so the Lamb estate was where they had the research group there. Now, earlier, John Myhill, the logician John Myhill, who had done initial work in Chicago, especially influenced by Anil Narod, had given a talk in Princeton about his work on automata. And so when Rabin and I got to the Lamb estate, to the IBM center, we didn't know what to do. So we said, well, maybe we should review this work about automata and to think about automata. And we thought we would try to look at it more from the point of view of model theory, think about structures, sort of more algebraic structures that way. So that's what got us started, the influence from John Myhill and indirectly through Anil Narod, who had just finished his thesis at Chicago. So that was really the genesis of the thing. Now, I went back and looked at our joint paper that was eventually published from the work that summer. And when it comes to non-deterministic automata, which is one of the things that's always noted that we introduced then, a non-deterministic automata is not a probabilistic automata. What it does is when it's making a transition from one state to the next, it has many choices that it can make rather than a specific choice. And so success in accepting a tape that the automaton is reading means that there is some path through the choices that eventually results in success. You don't have to worry about the paths that don't work out. You only have to find one successful one. I don't remember how we thought of doing it, except maybe we kept coming into problems that it was difficult to create the states to do various kind of decision questions. And so what we say in the paper is that non-deterministic automata are so much better because they require so many fewer states than deterministic automata. And of course, the proof that a non-deterministic automata accepts the same set of strings that a deterministic automata does is that you take the non-deterministic automata and to take the power set of all the states and treat those as new states and define a transition function on sets of states. So of course, the cardinality of the number of states goes up exponentially there. And so the original non-deterministic automata has many fewer states than the resulting deterministic automata. And also there are other reasons that the non-deterministic automatas made it easier to prove closure conditions for families of sets accepted by the automaton. But I don't remember why we thought of non-deterministic automata. All I can say at this late date is it somehow made life easier for us, and so we did that. Then that summer, at the end of that summer, was the National Science Foundation Summer Logic Conference, 6 weeks in Cornell. And that was the first big general meeting of logicians that had taken place in the United States. There had been smaller meetings through the Association of Symbolic Logic, also sometimes in connection with the American Mathematical Society, but they got through Halmos and through Rosser, and they had made an application to the National Science Foundation and got the summer conference. So practically anybody who was anybody in logic came to that summer conference. It was a beautiful summer in Cornell. And Rabin and I reported on our work on automata there. And then we together prepared the paper, which was submitted the next year, next academic year, to the IBM journal. And so that's roughly the story of that joint work at that time.
Thank you very much. Do you remember at all how the work was received at the Institute? I mean, it's not a long ago question.
No, I don't. I mean, it was a sort of theorem proof sort of thing.
Yeah.
People agreed that the proofs were nice and clean, and that was that. I don't recall any special enthusiasm about it at that time. Of course, the thing that later transpired was, of course, other people took up things, especially uh, uh, developing complexity theory, which made use of all kinds of work on automata by other people as well. And so certainly we had the paper that we wrote had an influence on uh, complexity theory that other people did. For example, Hartmanis was a leader there, to name one of them.
Yeah,
The
and
other
you,
thing was that Rabin went on to think about probabilistic automata as a sort of natural generalization. And
right,
then much later, he went on to think about infinitistic automata operating on trees and had very strong results there. Uh, but I didn't take part in any of those further developments myself.
right. But to make a start is incredibly important. But moving on, coming to your thesis work. So Tarski, like Hilbert, was interested in axiomatizing geometry in terms of various geometrical primitives. Your thesis was on that subject. Why was it of interest to you? Why did you like that as a thesis topic?
Well, I think back from school, geometry was what got me into mathematics more than algebra. That interested me in, well, I mean, the thing that you learn in geometry is thinking up a proof. In algebra, and partly in calculus too, you have a lot of procedures which you apply somewhat mechanically in order to solve the problems. But in geometry, you really have to think about proof. And so that's why I like geometry very much. And then when I was an undergraduate at Berkeley, Tarski's, uh, through JCC McKinsey, the associate of Tarski, had written up Tarski's decision method for elementary algebra and geometry. And so I studied that very much. And then also various questions came up about choosing primitives for geometry, like Hilbert used points and lines and such things, and Tarski did in his original formulations there. But there are other ways to take geometric relationships that are sufficient to define all the first order geometric operations. And so I had, as an undergraduate, I had thought about those things. Then when I was at Princeton and was trying to think of a thesis topic, it occurred to me that there was a question that I hadn't seen addressed before, namely comparing geometry, elementary geometry, uh, where the basis for geometry are flat subspaces like points, lines, planes, etc., for higher dimensions, and the incidence properties of a point lying on a plane and so forth. That's the basic structure that determines the geometry. And I hadn't seen any comparison about comparison of the geometries at different dimensions. And so after I thought about it, I realized that many incidence theorems are true at all dimensions.
Mhm.
And in fact, I was able to establish, and that's what became my thesis, that there is just one infinite dimensional geometry. That is to say, uh, as Tarski proved, completeness of the geometric axioms, and that in particular means that the theory is complete. Every theorem formulated with the primitives is either provable or disprovable. So it's a complete theory. So it turns out that the sequence of complete theories with different dimensions converges. There's only one infinite dimensional theory. Those are the theorems that are eventually true from some point on.
Right.
And so that was what I established in my thesis. Church didn't have anything to do with the development of the mathematics there, but he very kindly corrected the spelling in my thesis. I can credit him for helping me in the presentation there. Of course, Church was very much concerned with presentation and editing and those kind of things, and so those were valuable lessons from him. But he didn't really take part in the understanding of the geometry there. But he was happy to accept it as a thesis topic.
Good, thank you. There's so many interesting questions, but we need to move on, I guess. So the next one is this, well, it's a story which you might wish to tell, and it's a technical paper. It's with Fred and Morel, and that's about ultraproducts, and that was later of, it's much used to you and much used to the field. Can you tell us about the story there? What happened?
Yes, at the Summer Logic Conference, one afternoon where we were going somewhere with Tarski and I'm sure Anne Morel was there too, and some of the other graduate students of Tarski's. He brought up the observation that equational theories, if you now I have to think again how to say it. Equational theories are have a nice feature from the model theoretic point of view, that if you take the direct product of algebraic structures, then equation is true in the direct product if and only if it's true in all the structures. So direct products sort of take the intersection of the equational theories. And so Tarski pointed out that results could be obtained when you took the direct product there if you instead didn't say that it was true in all of the components, but it was eventually true in, say, order the components 1, 2, 3, 4, and say an equation is accepted if from some point on it's true in all of the components. And so that gives you other equational theories related to the ones you start with there. Rather than taking the intersection there, you sort of take what you might sort of call tail validity, eventually true there. And so that seemed a very interesting observation of Tarski's. So when I went back to Princeton in my last year then at Princeton, I thought very much about what happens with trying those kind of things with first order structures rather than equational structures. Frayne and Morel back in Berkeley, and Morel was then on sabbatical in Berkeley, and she was working with Thomas Frayne. And so independently, both of us came up with the fact that if you took products of first order structures modulo a filter, then you could say how things were satisfied, not individually in every possible component, but only in those where the set of terms at which you're thinking about are one of the sets in the filter. So that means sort of modulo what's in the filter. You only think that something has to be true sufficiently often, not always true there. It turned out that in Warsaw, Jerzy Wosch, logician there in Warsaw, had formulated this idea in a different kind of formulation that nobody in Berkeley understood at the time there. So it turned out that the using the filtered products and eventually the ultrafiltered products was equivalent to things that Wash had proved about it, but that only became clear somewhat later. But then I additionally proved that using this method there, one could prove compactness theorems about various kinds of satisfaction of theories using the ultraproduct construction, which was something that Freyne and Morel hadn't done. But we were working independently there, and then realized that we had several similar results, starting with Tarski's original observation about equational theories. In the meantime, Simon Koshin was working on things that went back to Erdős and other people in analysis, where they had thought of products of real numbers and things being true, not forever, but eventually true there. And so again, ultraproducts in a special case had been discovered by Erdős and people were thinking about functional analysis, and Simon Koshin also worked on that. And so those kind of strains all then came together in that year. That was in 57, 58. That was independently of my thesis work there, which I was writing up, but Koshin was thinking of the real closed fields from the functional analysis point of view, and Freyne and Morel were working under Tarski in Berkeley, and so those things eventually all came together that way.
Okay, so Dana, looking back over Princeton, over all these various things that happened, all the people you met, all the work you did, how do you think your time at Princeton influenced your approach to research?
Well, I think the key thing about Princeton is that it was really a center of the mathematical universe. So many famous people came through Princeton, and one heard them talk and met them. I mean, the Princeton faculty was very, very strong too. I wish I'd taken more advantage of what I could have learned at Princeton, but it gave me another view of the mathematical, all the mathematical lights. Hitzebrook was very, very impressive. I was very sorry that I missed Hermann Weyl. He had passed away. Of course, Einstein had passed away before I got to Princeton. Von Neumann was in the hospital already when I got there, and then died of cancer. So I miss seeing some of the very big historical figures there, but it was quite inspiring to see the kind of mathematicians that came through Princeton. And of course, the two key things that the Institute for Advanced Study did for me was introduce me to Kreisel, that we spoke about earlier, but also in the last year, there were many visitors. I can't remember which semester it was, but Church was away on sabbatical. I think that was a little bit earlier. And Kleene came in place of church and gave seminars and had many visitors too. So I got to know Kleene that way. I think that was in 56, 57. But then in 57, 58, my last year there, Halmos was visiting the Institute of Advanced Study. Much, much earlier, he had been von Neumann's assistant, but he was at the University of Chicago then in 57, 58. And so we got to know each other. He was very interested in algebraic logic. Tarski had a certain kind of cylindric algebras version of algebraic logic, and Halmos had a competing version, polyadic algebras, and two of Church's students got very much concerned with polyadic algebras and worked with Halmos, but I got to know him that way. And so it was his influence that got me an invitation to come as a beginning instructor, non-tenured instructor to the University of Chicago after my PhD in June of 1958. I went back to California. My mother had come out for the graduation, and we drove back to California. And then I came to Chicago at the end of the summer to start up my job there. And so it was Halmos's influence that was the reason that I came to Chicago. And of course, Halmos was working on a book on Boolean algebras then, and I consulted very much with him on that book at the time in Chicago. And so Halmos was a really key question for why I went to Chicago.
Right, and also, I mean, as well as Halmos, there were other people at Chicago that you knew and came to know. Can you tell us a little bit about them and their influence on you?
Well, it was a great pleasure to meet Marshall Stone. He had retired the previous year, but he was still very much around, and a very grand old man, a very special character. He is the most traveled person I've ever met. He is a person who knew a year in advance what hotel he was going to be staying at. One time I met him and I said, "Oh, I just read an interesting article about the Silk Road in Asia." He said, "Oh, yes, we were there last year. We went across it by Jeep." So you couldn't mention any place in the world, I think, that he hadn't visited or planned to visit. Other people there, of course, were Saunders MacLean, who became very important also in my life on many occasions. He was a major professor there at Chicago. Irving Kaplansky, the algebraist, was very, very impressive, and I got to know him that way. Antoni Zygmunt, the analyst, who wrote a marvelous book on complex function theory. I wish I had studied it more closely. He was teaching there too and had many students. It was a very, very lively atmosphere. Adrian Albert, the algebraist, was the chair of the department. So I went from a quite rich mathematical environment in Princeton to another rich mathematical environment at Chicago at that period.
You're making me jealous. So another environment was the Infinitistic Methods Conference at Warsaw in 1959, which was, I believe, your first trip to Europe. So that was presumably an experience in more than one way for you.
Yes, that was a very important experience of all the people that I met there. And of course, it was influenced. By that time, I had had a rapprochement with Tarski, and Tarski was instrumental in getting me invited to come to that. Montague was at that conference. Bob Vaught, a Tarski student, was also at that conference. And then, of course, we met the Polish logicians and many other European logicians also at that conference. Kleene was there also as a key member. But leading up to that was a very important thing for me in Chicago. Quite early when I arrived in Chicago in early 50 fall of 58. Wait, I'm confusing on the year. When did I get my degree at?
You came to Chicago in 58. I don't know when.
Oh yeah, no, the infinitistic methods conference was 59.
Yes.
We said
Oh,
57.
59.
We
Yeah.
said 57, but it is 59, or I may have been confused. Anyway, early in coming to Chicago, I met Stanley Tenenbaum. Stanley Tenenbaum was a close friend of John Myhill and other people. He had come as an early entrant to Chicago. Chicago had a terrible idea that bright high school students should come in maybe their junior year to college to get advance in education. It was a terrible idea because young people are not really ready to come into an adult environment like college. And the effect on Stanley was he never finished his undergraduate degree. He came to Chicago and took part in many things and met many people, but he never finished his undergraduate degree. And I've heard stories that other people who came as early entrants also were really emotionally badly affected by being pushed too early, too soon. But Stanley was an amazing personality. He was married with 3 children. I got to be a part of the family very soon, very close to the family. And Stanley had known Raymond Smulyan very well, who had a long time in Chicago there. Now, Raymond Smulyan, as a very young person in the in 39, 40 or so, uh, was very much involved in music and studied the piano. And that's where he met my wife and her family in San Francisco when he was very, very young. And so he had kept in touch with Irena Schreier and her uh, mother and her mother's husband that she married in Chicago. And they had many, many friends in common there. So in my very last year at Princeton, uh, Irena had been a contestant in a contest, a piano contest in New York, and somehow had done very, very poorly in that and was very discouraged. Raymond was there in New York, and they met up, and he said, "Let me take you to Princeton, where I'm a graduate student, and I'll introduce you to Emil Artin, who was one of your father's closest friends." They had been Privatdozents in Hamburg in 1928-29 and had done work together. There's a Art and Schreier paper on real closed fields. That's very important connection there, which then connected to the work of Tarski on the decision method for real numbers. And so Raymond said, "I can introduce you to your father's best friend there from that time." Irena was conceived in Hamburg, but her father died from poor health just a month before she was born. And then her mother went to the grandparents, his parents in Vienna, where Irena was born in Vienna, not in Hamburg. So Irena was very keen to meet Artin. He was a very dramatic character. He was extremely thin, piercing eyes, and when she was introduced to him, he looked at her and said, "Tell me, do you share your father's unfortunate liking for Brahms?" And she said, "Yes, yes, of course. Brahms is very important to me." Artin was only interested in Bach and contemporary music. He was quite musical himself, and both of his sons, I think, were musical. But he didn't like Brahms, and so Irena was very impressed by that. I met then Irena at the math department at Princeton on the stairway. You entered down on the ground floor, and then the uh, uh, social room upstairs. You went up the stairs. That's where Artin held out during the tea time there, talking to people, and that's where Raymond was taking. Uh, that's where Raymond was taking Irena to meet Artin upstairs, and so Irena and I were introduced very, very briefly on the stairway in Princeton there. However, when I got to Chicago, it turned out that through the connection with Raymond Smulyan, Tarski, Stanley Tenenbaum knew very well Raymond, who was in Chicago quite often there. And so the connection between Raymond and the Schreiers introduced me again to Irena, and that's where we really came together and developed a relationship. We then met through relatives of um, still relatives from the San Francisco years in the summer of 59. And that's where we really became engaged. And so then we planned to get married in the fall of 59. We met in California, and then when we came back to Chicago, we planned to get married. But this conference in Warsaw came up in October of 59. And so I left Irena with the problems of dissolving both our apartments and moving everything into the new apartment, and then was a week away in Warsaw, and then came back and we were immediately married just before my birthday in the second week of October there. But it was a connection through Stanley Tenenbaum that made it possible that we met up. And so that's a key thing that totally influenced my life. Of course, Tenenbaum and I thought a lot about logic. He was very keen on many things, and there were many things we thought about together. In particular, it turned out that uh, he came up he thought very, very much about post problem, uh, which was something very important in recursive function theory. But then in our discussions, he was thinking about using non-standard models somehow in trying to get a simpler proof of post problem about intermediate degrees. But in thinking about non-standard models, it occurred to him that he could make an argument there to show that there are no computable non-standard models satisfying the laws of first order arithmetic. Mostowski, whom I met in Warsaw, uh, who had been a Tarski student, was very chagrined that Tenenbaum came up with such a tidy proof of that, because he would have loved to have proved that theorem. And so that's still known today as Tenenbaum's theorem. we did a lot of other work together, which unfortunately was lost because when I left Chicago in the end of the next academic year, Stanley was also leaving to take up a job, and he had all of our papers that we had, things that we had written down in a big box, which was in the back of his car. But when he was visiting New York in connection with jobs, the car was broken into and that box of papers was stolen. I'm sure it was dumped within 10 minutes when people saw what it was. And so a lot of the work we'd done together never saw the light of day, which is too bad. But in any case, Stanley was a big influence on me because he was interested in so many things. One very good thing the friendship with him did was that he wanted to understand how Gödel had proved the independence, no, had proved the the consistency, I'm sorry, getting mixed up, how Gödel had proved the consistency of the axiom of choice by introducing Gödel's constructible, so-called constructible sets. Now, I knew and understood what the result was, but I had never paid really much attention to the proof. So it was explaining from Gödel's monograph, explaining the proof of the Gödel's consistency proof. That was the first time that I really understood it. It was very important that I got to understand it that way. But it was, I had to explain it to someone. So often you don't understand something until you explain it to someone else. And that was a major thing that happened to me because of Stanley Tenenbaum.
Yeah, that's a great story. It's a pity you never published papers together, but still many good things happened. So after that, I guess then you moved back home, so to speak, to the origin, to Berkeley. How did that happen? How did you get from Chicago to Berkeley? Because you'd already extracted urania, so you didn't need to go back.
Well, no, we were married in Chicago, and then we had uh, 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 5960, we were together in an apartment there after our marriage near the University of Chicago. She was teaching at a music school in the North Shore of Chicago. And so this was my second year as an instructor at Chicago, a non-tenured position. However, Chicago was one of the major mathematical centers of the country. And so when it came time to finish my term, 2 years as an instructor there, they decided not to hire me further there. And so I had only the 2-year appointment in Chicago. Fortunately, earlier, and of course, through the both through AMS conferences and through the Warsaw Conference, I had a full rapprochement with Tarski in the meantime. And so it turned out that at the University of California in Berkeley, they had just started a new institute for both younger and older mathematicians. And so it was arranged that I could have a fellowship at Berkeley as a Miller Fellow, which would also then evolve into an appointment at the University of California. And so that opportunity to have a nice fellowship was then what brought me to Berkeley. And so we moved to Berkeley in the summer of 1960.
Right. Well, turning to the research that you did in Berkeley, you've got a famous paper, Measurable Cardinals and Constructible Sets, which sounds quite technical, but it's very important. And can you tell us why it's significant and how you came to think of the result?
Well, it wasn't immediately then in 1960, it was a little bit later. I was 3 years at Berkeley before I went to Stanford.
Oh, okay, sorry, got it wrong.
And so it was sort of the middle of that. But one of the things that happened was that there was enormous activity on using ultraproducts. So, for example, uh, a student came up from Southern California to work with Tarski, Jerome Kiesler. And he was very, very taken with things about ultraproducts. He proved dozens and dozens of theorems about ultraproducts and properties of them. He proved so many theorems about ultraproducts that Tom Frayne, who was still trying to get his PhD thesis, had nothing else to do. And Tom Frayne never got his PhD because Jerry Kiesler and other people proved so many things about ultraproducts. Another big area was large cardinals. Tarski and Erdos had much earlier proven a number of things about uh, large cardinals, and that was also taken up very much. I mean, Tarski's influence from foundations of set theory uh, very much uh, put in the fore the questions about behavior of large cardinals. And so any number of people worked on large cardinals. Some of Tarski's students, and then also there were a lot of connections with the ultraproducts because ultrafilters are connected with large cardinals because you ask whether the ultrafilter is closed under infinitary intersections, not just finite intersections. And so there are a lot of problems about ultrafilters that connect up with properties of large cardinals. So Bill Hanf and I together introduced some things about undescribable cardinals, very much larger cardinals than just measurable cardinals. But then in thinking about measurable cardinals, it occurred to me, what happens if you really seriously look at ultraproducts over measures coming from measurable cardinals with extra infinitary properties? Earlier, Tarski had influenced any number of people in thinking about infinitistic logic. And so these infinitistic ultraproduct constructions were connected with things about infinitistic logic, just as ordinary ultraproducts were connected with things about ordinary first order logic. And so the generalization involving larger cardinals uh, uh, came up. But then what I realized in thinking about, I mean, it's also, as I mentioned, the earlier questions about non-standard models there were also connected with ultraproducts non-standard analysis that Abraham Robinson had taken up very, very strongly. In any case, in thinking about ultraproducts with infinitistic properties there, it occurred to me that if you took an ultraproduct, ultrapower with a measurable cardinal of the model of set theory, then because of properties of non-standard numbers that we understood about submodels and supermodels, I mean, a non-standard analysis you could think of as an expansion of standard numbers. So it also would work the same way with sets and things like that, that ultraproducts would give you expansions. But then there would be uh, inner models and outer models that you would get using these infinitistic ultraproducts there. But Gödel had shown that the constructible sets were a minimal model, really. And so it would turn out then that if you use the measurable problems of a measurable cardinal and the infinitistic ultrapower, then you would have a model for set theory where the constructible sets were contained in a submodel, and the measurable cardinal was then outside of the submodel. And so when you put 2 and 2 together there, it turns out then that because of the minimal properties of the constructible sets,
I see.
there could be no measurable cardinal inside the constructible sets, because you showed that the constructible sets were much, much, much smaller than the measurable cardinal when you allowed for the measurable cardinal. So the measurable cardinal couldn't be inside the constructible sets, because the argument analogous to non-standard analysis was that the measurable cardinal was outside of the constructible sets. And so that's how I proved that measurable cardinals contradicted V equals L Gödel's statement that all sets are constructible. It turned out that a very brilliant young logician in Prague at the very same time found the same proof there, Vopenka, and then he established a school in Prague with many, many very productive logicians coming out of Czechoslovakia at the time. So we stumbled on the same result at the same time, and that my motivation came from Tarski's infinitistic logic and thinking of what kind of analogous to non-standard analysis would work out when you thought in terms of these infinitistic ultraproducts.
Thank you. That's fascinating. Do you feel like commenting on the further development of arch cardinals? You didn't take part in it yourself, but you no doubt observed it.
I don't have any special comments on it, no.